In today's video, we're going to learn all about jumping gaps, and to do that, we need to make one small addition to the warehouse. This box right here is called Scrappy. It's my go-to box for teaching technique. I like to eliminate all the other elements when it comes to learning stuff and just break it down to the basics. So having a curb height box is absolutely perfect for the warehouse. Now it's called Scrappy because it's made from all the other scraps from the boxes we've built in this warehouse. But make no mistake, this box is the MVP of the shred spot. At the end of last year, I picked up this competition trials bike from Krukers, and a big reason why we're going to work on gaps today is that I want to push my own technique on this bike to see how far I can jump. Now, one note about the skill we're going to learn today is that you don't need a competition trials bike to do it. I just happen to have this one, and I'm going to push it as hard as I possibly can. But any bike in this warehouse could get the job done, so don't worry if you don't have a bike without a seat. You can still do everything that we're about to work through. We're going to quickly build a companion box for Scrappy, and it's going to be the exact same height, so we have a flat gap to work with. We're not jumping up or down or anything to get across it. It's just an even gap. It's also pretty short, so it's a low consequence environment to learn gaps, so we can just focus in on the technique itself and not be worried about height or anything like that. Now, before I put this box together, the thing I need to tell you is that you don't need to make boxes in order to learn how to gap. The most common way that people learn, including myself, is they get two pallets, and you have these two pallets that you put down on the ground and you start moving them further and further apart as you begin to learn the technique. That's the easiest way to progress gaps, but before we get into all of that stuff, I'm going to teach you how to do this on flat ground so you can work on the technique without even needing a pallet or a box or anything else, and we'll work our way up from there. Now that we've got all the scraps cut to size, we can do a quick assembly of this box. Too easy. I'm getting pretty fast at building these things if I do say so myself. Now let's go focus in on the gap technique. Before we start jumping between boxes, we need to talk about the foundation of this technique, the pedal kick. This is the one element that needs to be in place before you start jumping gaps. I'm going to go through a quick refresher on it right now, but I'm also going to put a link in the description of this video to a full tutorial that's just focused in on pedal kicks. I'm also going to put a back wheel hop one in there as well, because what we're doing in this technique today is hopping on our back wheel from one point to another. So you need to be able to hop on your back wheel, and you also need to be able to pedal kick from the back wheel. We're going to go through all of it right now, but those two videos will go even deeper if there's anything that you're really struggling with on either one. The easiest way for me to explain the concept of the pedal kick is that it's the interaction between your pedals and your brakes. As you push on the pedals, you release the brakes, and that's what unleashes the power of the bike. The more efficient you get at this interaction between pushing on the pedals and letting off the brakes, the more power that you'll have to jump the bike in any direction. We're going to build on the pedal kick concept by talking about preload. And preload is kind of what you're doing with your bike and your body before you do that pedal kick. So if you're on your back wheel getting ready for a big gap, what you would be doing for preload is lowering your front wheel and leaning to the back of the bike. And then as you push the pedals, you pull your handlebars toward your chest as you kick. And that gives you even more power to make the jump. One interesting way that people like to visualize this process is with a pair of scissors. So if you're on your back wheel of the bike, you lower your front wheel down and you lean your body weight back. And then when you're ready to hit the pedals, you snap it all back together. Our first step to put it all together is to find an area that has flat ground and just get up on your back wheel and do a rolling pedal kick, meaning that you're not even jumping, you're just giving it a little bit of a kick to move the bike on its back wheel from one point to another. Just focus on getting that right, and then add a little bit of sauce to it so you do that first hop. That's all we need to do to get this process started. It might seem really straightforward the way that I've explained it here, but this is the area where most people struggle with this technique. I'm going to walk you through 3 things that you might be doing wrong and some tips to fix each one. The main culprit that messes up a lot of people when they're learning this is that they're too far forward on the bike. And one tip for that is to look down and see if you can see your rear hub through your legs. If you can't do that, you're too far forward on the bike. Start there. So the idea is that you want the bike to be able to jump, which means it's out in front of you. When you put the power to the pedals, it jumps and you're holding on for the ride. If you're over the bottom bracket like this, you're having to lift all of your body weight on top of it, and this is an equation that's not going to let you jump very far. If you're back here, it's a completely different story. And also, it's going to give you a better opportunity to do that preload than if you're up here. Being able to preload from here, there's not really much movement. Speaking of preload, that's the next problem that people have. When it comes to learning trials and all, people don't exaggerate their movements as they're trying to learn it, and that's a big problem because what you think you're doing versus what you're actually doing is quite different. And you'll learn this real quick if you're filming yourself riding. What you want to do is get as much of a preload as you possibly can. Over-exaggerate this movement. Really get this whole pedal kick and front wheel drop thing put together in the right way. That's going to give you a huge boost. The third thing people struggle with is having a snap that's too slow. Now, when you first learn the pedal kick, we just did that rolling thing where we went from point A to point B, just rolling on the ground. But as we started working on our hop, you really kick the pedals. That's why it's called a pedal kick instead of a pedal push. So this whole thing, the snap, where you pull up on the handlebars and you push down on the pedals and you're letting go of the brakes real quick, that's a really important element to get you the power that you need to jump farther. One thing we should probably discuss on gaps is how to land. And what I do when I'm jumping a gap is I grab my rear brake about halfway through the gap so that when I land, I've got my rear brake locked in. The next thing I do is I spread my knees a little bit wide and I sink down over the back of the bike so that I'm anchoring all of my weight back here on the corner of the box. And this is going to help you out not only for jumping gaps, but for in the future when you want to continue staying on your back wheel after you've jumped a gap or after you've dropped down. This sinking motion over the back wheel to concentrate your weight back here is super important. We've got the foundation in place now for jumping gaps, and the next step is to move on to 3 different scenarios that are going to help you learn this and build confidence so that you can start working on getting some distance. So these 3 scenarios are essentially building blocks to get you to this level of doing big gaps. The way that I like to think about everything that we do in this warehouse is just eliminating as much as possible so we can focus on each element of the technique. And we're going to do these 3 scenarios to give you each one of the elements that you're going to need to eventually put together to be able to jump between 2 features. The thing that I need to make clear to you now is that the difference between jumping a 1-foot gap and a 6-foot gap is not actually that different. The technique is essentially the same, just one has a lot more power behind it. So what it really comes down to learning this technique is consistency and confidence. Once you've built those up using these building blocks, you'll be able to progress very quickly. So our first scenario is just flat ground. We're working on the technique itself. We're working on our timing. We're working on our pedal kick, our snap, our preload, all of those things into effect, but in a super low consequence environment. So the way I normally recommend this is get a piece of duct tape and put it on the ground, put a stick down, find a crack on the ground, and start gapping from that point. Our second scenario is the drop gap. And for this one, you only need 1 obstacle. So you could start with a curb, you could start with a small box like we just made here in the warehouse. If you've been riding trials for a little bit, you've probably already done this as a way to get off an obstacle. You've probably dropped off on your back wheel, but instead of dropping it smooth, you've kicked out. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to get on the back wheel and we're going to pedal kick off the ledge intentionally. Now you might work yourself up to jumping out a little bit farther at this point. So instead of just jumping straight down, maybe try to jump out a little bit just to get that first movement. This is going to give you a good sense of how far you probably could jump if you were jumping between 2 obstacles by jumping off of something. The other thing this is going to help you with is your takeoff. So a lot of people, when they first start learning gaps, they take off really far away from the edge. And that's kind of shortchanging how far you can actually jump. The closer you can get to that edge of the gap, the farther you'll be able to jump. If you're jumping from like 6 inches back, you're losing all of that extra distance that you would have had. So it's really about teaching you how to get to the edge of the gap and how to jump off of that to get distance. Finally, scenario 3 is the actual flat to flat gap where you have 2 obstacles that are the same height. And a lot of people use pallets to do this because it's low. It's maybe 6 inches off the ground, super low consequence, and pallets are pretty light, so you can move them apart just a little bit at a time. That's exactly how I learned to do this thing, and I recommend you try it yourself. Get your hands on 2 pallets and just start moving them further and further apart. One thing that I need to say at this point in your development is that you don't get extra points for jumping things that are high up in the air. Start small, start low, remove as much consequence as you can, especially as you're going through this phase of becoming confident and consistent. Spend your mental energy on the technique itself, not worrying about what happens if you miss the ledge or you come up short. Even for me, I'm testing this brand new bike out and I built something that's 1 foot off the ground. I have boxes that are the same height that are 2 feet off the ground, but that extra mental energy of, oh man, what if I fall off that? I don't need that. I just want to start low and get everything locked in so I'm super confident, and that's what you should do too. We've got everything else out of the way, so now's the fun part. We're gonna see how far we can jump our bikes. So one thing I wanna tell you as you're learning how to jump farther and farther is to use your bike as the measuring stick. I do have a measuring tape here in the warehouse, but what's important is that I won't always have that with me when I'm riding. And so I use my bike and the length of my bike to tell how far I can jump. And that gives me even more confidence when I'm out riding. If I find a gap that looks reasonable, I put my bike up next to it and be like, that's right, I can jump a couple feet further than my front wheel, or I can jump this high, or whatever. Your bike is a measuring stick and you should absolutely use it that way. You know, there's actually an easier way to do this. It's a technique called the wheelie gap. If you want to learn that too, there's a video for it right here.